Report of interrogation of crew of U-95, a 500-ton U-boat, sunk on 28th November 1941, in position approximately 36 degrees by 21 north and 3 degrees by 27 west. Section 1. Introductory Remarks. Prisoners from U-95 and U-433 arrived at the Interrogation Center together on 21st December 1941 and were interrogated at the same time. Both this report and the report on U-433 contain only such information as concerns these boats. General information obtained from these prisoners will be embodied in the subsequent report on U-451. As some weeks had elapsed since their respective boats were sunk until prisoners were interrogated, and because they had ample opportunity of conversing together, interrogation proved difficult. Prisoners stated that U-95 had made 7 war cruises and had sunk approximately 60,000 tons of shipping. Section 2. Crew of U-95. Of the total complement of U-95, 45 in all, only 4 officers, 2 chief petty officers, 1 petty officer, and 5 ratings survived. The commanding officer, Captain Lieutenant Gert Schreiber, was born in 1912 in Hirschberg, Silesia, and belonged to the 1931 term, to which, amongst others, Prien and Lemp also belonged. He was of small stature, well-spoken, but determined not to answer any questions, even those which were of no significance to the war. He was married and had 1 child. His determined character was exemplified in his almost successful attempt to escape with Oberleutnant Zersi I of U-433 from captivity whilst in Gibraltar. As Lieutenant Zersi in 1936 and again as Oberleutnant Zersi in 1937, he had served in U-34, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Sobe, then in U-Flotilla Salzwedel. In 1938, he served as torpedo officer in the cruiser Königsberg and was promoted to Captain Lieutenant in October 1939. Schreiber had spent some time in Spanish waters, possibly during the Civil War, and made a war cruise with Captain Lieutenant Just in U-59 early in 1940. It seems probable that U-95 was commissioned during the first half of 1940, and that Schreiber was her only commanding officer, in which case he may previously have completed a U-boat commanding officer's course early in 1940, and then been appointed to stand by his U-boat some weeks before commissioning. He had been awarded the Iron Cross First Class in November 1940. The first lieutenant, Oberleutnant Zersi Egon Rudolph, 26 years of age, belonged to the 1935 term. He was promoted to Lieutenant Zersi in April 1938. He was an extreme Nazi, unpleasant and bloodthirsty. He was confident that an attack on Gibraltar and the invasion of Great Britain would be successfully accomplished with great brutality. The junior officer, Oberleutnant Zersi Hans Epach, was born in 1917 in Saxony and belonged to the 1935 term. He was married. In 1938, he had been transferred to the Air Force, in which service prisoners stated he had over 100 operational flights to his credit, having flown Heinkel aircraft and been awarded the Goldene Frontsflugspange decoration. This oak leaves decoration is awarded to officers who have made 110 operational flights. He had been serving in the Air Force for 4 years and had experience with torpedo and rescue aircraft. He returned to the naval service during the summer of 1941 and had, in consequence, little U-boat experience. He was very self-confident and arrogant. Lieutenant M.A., Sublieutenant in Marine Artillery, Kraupa Tuscany, joined U-95 before her last cruise, replacing Oberleutnant Zersi Hessermann, who had previously been the first lieutenant. He was a Viennese, 31 years of age, and claimed to have been a journalist interested in photography. He was clearly a political upstart, and no doubt, through influence, had succeeded in obtaining a commission in the Marine Artillery without, however, possessing any knowledge of guns. As far as could be ascertained, he had no naval qualifications, although he was a keen yachtsman with some Mediterranean experience. The engineer officer, Oberleutnant Engineer Korda, and 2 midshipmen under training, Schrimpf and Groschwitz, did not survive. The 2 surviving chief petty officers were sound and capable men of some experience. The chief quartermaster, 28 years of age, had previously served in the Hamburg-America line and joined the Navy in 1933. He had served in other U-boats, possibly U-9 in 1939 and U-44 in 1940, and had earned the Iron Cross, first and second class. He had a knowledge of the Mediterranean and of all types of warships. He kept a watch as officer of the watch and assisted the commanding officer with navigation. The chief boatswain's mate, aged 25, had joined the Navy in 1936, had served in the destroyer Hermann Scheunemann. He was drafted to the U-boat arm early in 1940 and appears to have joined U-95 on commissioning. He expressed the opinion that he would have preferred to have remained in surface ships. The surviving boatswain's mate was only 24 years of age and had joined the Navy in 1936. He had undergone training in the 3rd Mine-Sweeping Flotilla at Cuxhaven and joined the U-boat service at the end of 1939 and was drafted in August 1940 to the administrative headquarters of the 3rd U-boat Flotilla, then based on Kiel, subsequently transferring early in January 1941 to the 7th Flotilla at Saint-Nazaire. He appears to have been drafted to U-95 in March 1941. The 5 surviving ratings were young men with little experience, although it was stated that nearly everyone had made previous cruises, especially the technical ratings. On the whole, the morale and health of officers and men appeared to be good, with the exception of 1 or 2 ratings who suffered from shock and loss of memory as the result of the torpedo detonation which sank their boat. They had, as usual, been well drilled in security matters, were stubborn when under interrogation, and apprehensive of microphones. Section 3. Early History of U-95. U-95 was a 500-ton U-boat, type 7C, of the series U-93 to U-102, built by the Germania Yard Kiel. Of the last 12 survivors, no one had stood by her during the final states of construction, had taken part in her trials, or had been on board during her first 2 cruises, with the possible exception of Captain Lieutenant Schreiber, who proved adamantly reticent and was useless for interrogating purposes. Details of U-95's early history are, therefore, necessarily incomplete. As U-93 is known to have been commissioned in June 1940, and U-99 and U-100 in April and May 1940, respectively, it seems probable that U-95 was commissioned at about the same time. She was laid down in June 1939, before the outbreak of war. On one of her first two cruises, probably the first, U-95 sailed from her base in Germany to Lorient. It may be assumed that she took the route north-about round the Shetlands to the Atlantic. Survivors' knowledge of U-95's movements date from March 1941, when a petty officer prisoner joined the U-boat in Lorient. Section 4. Earlier cruises of U-95. Third War Cruise of U-95. A petty officer prisoner stated that U-95 sailed from Lorient on her third war cruise at the beginning of March 1941. It would appear that she came speedily into contact with a convoy in the North Atlantic, and the prisoner claimed that she succeeded in torpedoing 4 ships during nighttime. U-95 was detected by the convoy's escort and suffered an attack during which 20 depth charges were counted. None of these depth charges damaged the U-boat. With her remaining torpedoes, U-95 succeeded in torpedoing 2 further ships which were sailing alone. These last 2 ships were claimed by the prisoner to have been approximately 6,000 tons each. NID note: this may be an exaggerated account of the attack on Oscar Baker 293 on 7th March 1941. 4 ships of the convoy were torpedoed, but 2 of these succeeded in reaching harbor. Wolverine and Chelsea dropped a number of depth charges on a contact without visible effect. A number of U-boats took part in this attack, including U-47 Prien, U-99 Kretschmer, and U-70 Matz. The latter was sunk later on the same day by Camellia and Arbutus. As U-95 had expended all her torpedoes, she put back to St. Nazaire, having been at sea some 3 weeks. She claimed 6 ships sunk, totaling 32,000 tons. The single prisoner who had taken part in this cruise stated that on arrival in St. Nazaire, he was immediately drafted to U-90 to take the place of the boatswain of that U-boat who had injured his foot. He believed that U-95 remained 1 month in St. Nazaire, where small repairs were effected. A second petty officer who joined the U-boat at this time stated that this was not the case, and that U-95 sailed on her 4th war cruise on 26th March 1941. If this is so, it would appear that she only stayed long enough in St. Nazaire to complete with oil and to embark further torpedoes and fresh provisions. 4th war cruise of U-95. According to a prisoner, U-95 left St. Nazaire on 27th March 1941 on her 4th war cruise. She again made for the North Atlantic, and it was alleged that after proceeding to an area between the Shetlands and the Faroes, she passed south of Iceland and sailed to within 400 miles of the Canadian coast. U-95 then received orders from Vice Admiral U-boats to proceed at full speed to intercept a convoy off Greenland, but this convoy appears to have passed to the southward of her and was missed. Her single success on this cruise was to sink a steamer of between 5,000 and 6,000 tons, expending 2 bow torpedoes. No further attack was made on this cruise, and U-95 returned to St. Nazaire still carrying 12 torpedoes after having been at sea between 4 and 5 weeks. U-95 appears to have spent a further 4 weeks in St. Nazaire before leaving on her next war cruise. 5th war cruise of U-95. According to prisoners, U-95 sailed on her 5th war cruise at the beginning of June 1941. The petty officer who had been drafted to U-90 had now returned to U-95 and took part in this cruise. It was stated that U-95 again operated in the North Atlantic and had only one encounter with an Allied ship. A large number of torpedoes were said to have been fired at this ship, all of which missed. A prisoner remarked that Schreiber was infuriated by the result of this attack, said that they had already risked enough, and ordered U-95 to surface and close in order to spray the gun positions of the merchantmen with machine gun fire, while concentrating the fire of her 8.8 centimeter gun on the bridge at a range of about 1,000 yards. After this order had been carried out, U-95 ceased fire and waited until the officers and crew were in their boats and clear of the ship. The merchant vessel was then sunk with U-95's last torpedo from the stern tube. Even the release of this torpedo caused considerable anxiety, as during the previous firing, an air torpedo had been mistaken for an electric one. Prisoners stated that the officers on the bridge were anxiously gazing at their stopwatches and wondering why no detonation had occurred at the expected time. A few seconds later, however, the electric torpedo hit and sank the ship. Prisoners said that the discipline showed by the British crew was outstanding, as they refused all offers of assistance and pulled away from the U-boat when their officers ordered them to do so. NID note: it has not been possible to name the ship to which this claim refers. The story appears to be exaggerated. A petty officer survivor stated that the torpedo officer responsible for this expensive attack excessively drilled and trained the crew when he came aboard, and that during exercises his results were exceptionally good. In action, however, he was a nervous man and was found to be useless. He later left the ship and underwent further training in torpedo firing and attained the remarkably high average of 72% of hits. He is now said to be an instructor in Norway, probably at the School for Prospective U-Boat Commanders at Trondheim. It was stated that this officer was Oberleutnant Siegfried Hessemann, who was at this time notorious for purloining stores from French bases. As U-95 had wasted all her torpedoes on this attack, she returned to Saint-Nazaire, where she arrived at the beginning of July 1941, having been at sea 1 month to the day, as one prisoner claimed. Sixth War Cruise of U-95. According to prisoners, U-95 sailed on her sixth war cruise at the beginning of August 1941, having been in dock for 4 weeks. She again proceeded to the North Atlantic. The only sinking on this cruise was a small vessel described by one prisoner as a motor ship of about 500 tons, having no funnel and sailing alone. This attack was made about 500 miles west of Ireland and was carried out at night. It was alleged by another prisoner that this ship was the Trinidad. The captain was stated to be Portuguese, and he was ordered to board U-95 to show his papers, which proved to be of Panamanian origin. Among the papers was found a delivery bill signed by a Dublin ship's chandler, and although intelligible conversation was difficult, it was suspected that the captain's home was also in Ireland. On account of these facts, it was decided to take no chances, and the ship was sunk by 30 rounds from the 8.8 centimeter gun, after the crew of 16 had taken to 2 lifeboats. The crew of U-95 claimed that they had later read in the newspapers that the survivors of this ship had been picked up and landed in Ireland. This sinking was stated to have taken place about 10 days after the start of U-95's cruise. It would appear from prisoners' statements that U-95 was attacked by a Sunderland aircraft on this cruise, about 8 to 10 days before she returned to port. It was alleged that 3 or 4 bombs were dropped shortly after the U-boat had submerged. Only such minor damage as the blowing of a few fuses were caused. NID note: Trinidad was sunk on 5th September in about 48.5 degrees north and 15 degrees west. Sunderland attacks were made A on 8th September in about 47 degrees 4 north and 11 degrees 37 west. B on 10th September in 46 degrees 23 north and 11 degrees 22 west. Neither of these positions appear very likely for a U-boat still 10 days from the end of its patrol, but Trinidad's position agrees to some extent. After being at sea approximately 6 weeks for her one success, U-95 returned to Lorient, arriving on or about 18th December 1941. Here, U-95 put into dry dock, where she lay for 3 weeks while diesel and other repairs were carried out. Her total stay in Lorient amounted to about 7 weeks, and during this time the crew were granted periods of leave up to 18 days each. On one occasion during this stay, there was an air attack, and U-95 was moved to a U-boat shelter, which she occupied alone. Prisoners said that no special precautions were taken to camouflage her while she was lying outside the shelter. While U-95 was in Lorient, Oberleutnant Zersi Hessemann was appointed away, and it seems probable that Oberleutnant Zersi Rudolph now relieved him as first lieutenant. Here, Sub-Lieutenant Kraupe Tuscany joined the ship, and other changes took place among the ratings. Section 5. Seventh and last cruise of U-95. According to prisoners, U-95 sailed from Lorient on 16th November 1941 at 1600 hours upon her seventh and last cruise. It was stated that one other 500-ton U-boat accompanied U-95 as she left harbor, but this U-boat was not bound for the Mediterranean and parted company almost immediately. An escort of 3 patrol vessels was provided for the first few hours of the voyage. It is not known whether U-95 sailed under sealed orders, as in the case of U-433, but prisoners were fully aware that they were bound for an Italian base when sunk. The voyage to Gibraltar passed off without incident, and at approximately 01:30 on the night of 24th November 1940, U-95 slipped through the straits on the surface. Prisoners stated that they passed through the middle of the straits and saw searchlights from the rock, which did not, however, sweep their U-boat. U-95 remained lurking in the eastern approaches to Gibraltar for the next 4 days, making no attack during this time. Section 6. Sinking of U-95. A terse signal from the Netherlands submarine O-21 stated that while returning to Gibraltar at 00:30 on 28th November 1941, when in position 36 degrees 21 north and 03 degrees 27 west, a German U-boat was sighted astern. The U-boat followed the Netherlands submarine and challenged her. O-21 fired 2 stern torpedoes, one of which sank the U-boat. 4 officers, including the captain, and 8 ratings were rescued out of a total complement of 45. According to prisoners' statements, U-95 had sighted O-21 at 2300 hours on 27th November 1941. Neither lookouts nor officers could make up their minds about the identity of the strange submarine, her angle of inclination as seen from the conning tower of U-95 making this exceptionally difficult. Schreiber proceeded to stalk his quarry, not caring to risk an attack until he could be convinced that he was not attempting to sink a sister U-boat. Shortly before 0020, 3 ratings were ordered to man the 2-centimeter gun, and a signalman was instructed to flash a challenge with a pocket torch. Scarcely had this been done when the tracks of 2 torpedoes were seen on the starboard bow and rudder was put hard a starboard. The first torpedo did not explode, but possibly grazed the boat. The second struck U-95 on the stern. There was a blinding explosion which blew most of the men on the conning tower into the water. It was stated that U-95 sank within 6 or 7 seconds, it being presumed that her stern had been blown off. Not a man from below decks survived, with the exception of the boatswain's mate, who was proceeding on deck, and was blown through the conning tower hatch. NID note: in fact, O-21 fired 2 torpedoes independently. The first was aimed directly at the U-boat and apparently missed to starboard. The U-boat's alteration of course was observed, and the second torpedo was fired, aimed 2 degrees before the U-boat's bow. The range was 200 yards. A graphic account of the sinking of U-95 was given by the boatswain's mate during interrogation, when he made the following statement. The old man said I might go on best watch from 1800 to 2000 hours. He was a queer customer, but he knew quite a lot about his job, and he and I got along very well together. I used to give him some assistance when he was taking bearings of the stars and so on. I used to write down the figures and help a little with the calculations and get out the charts and help him to plot the course and so on. Well, he said to me, that's the end of our keeping watch together. The new lieutenant is to take the watch. When we had been at sea 10 to 12 days, he said, the first lieutenant will go ashore in Italy, and then I'll see to it that we get our watch together again. Then he said, the first lieutenant is going on watch tomorrow morning at 0400 instead of the chief quartermaster. When I came off watch, I happened to meet him. I said, shall we have a little celebration this evening? He replied, I'll be along later. He brought a glass of brandy, and we sat down. There were 4 of us, and we played scat. When I go on watch at 0400, I usually turn in at 10:30 past. By that time, after the news, I am tired enough to fall asleep at 2300 and wake up at 0400. At 2300, we were just going to stop, after one more hand, when suddenly the order came through the speaking tube, spoken in a rather quiet voice. Lower deck action stations. We thought it was a joke. We heard that someone on deck had seen a shadow, that a rating in the conning tower, returning with his smoke, came in and said, there is something happening. Then they all came along and nobody said a word. The control room was quite quiet. All of a sudden, the loudspeaker said, lower deck action stations. Number 1 boatswain's mate was asleep at that moment. Number 3 was due to go out on watch. He came out of his bunk and said, what's up? I put on my leather jacket and quickly put my cigarette case in my pocket, folded back the seat, and went up into the conning tower. Then number 1 said, take your life jacket, we're in for something. At that moment, I had no idea where mine was. Under my pillow, perhaps. Anyway, I said, time to fetch that later. And as I went into the conning tower, the order came from the control room, port. My God, I thought, what's happening now? The men forward opened the torpedo tube caps. Can you imagine how they ran forward to open them? Then the show started. What sort of boat was she? Italian? German? There had been 3 other boats with us. In the meantime, we got the order, close the caps, then again open the caps, then another order to close them. The men forward were starting to curse. Then for the 3rd time they wanted to fire. The order was given again, open the caps. As we were about to make our 4th approach, they spotted us before we came too close. It was a beautiful moonlit night, just 3 days before full moon. You could see your way about better than by day, when it is often a bit misty down there at that time of year. You could see the coast and the dark mountains better than by day. When we were seen, we were in an unfavorable position with the moon behind us. They could see us in the moonlight better than we could see them. When we still held our fire, they drew away and showed their stern, so we challenged them 2 or 3 times in Morse. The captain ordered, "Guns, crew, clear away." As a matter of fact, we always had the guns ready, and the ammunition lay ready below in the control room. It always lies there. So the first thing was to get the gun loaded and sights on the target. For the time being, I was to stay in the conning tower in case we began to fire. I had my recorder with me in the conning tower as a messenger. He was there to take notes, because I have to write down the data when we fire. He said we must hoist a few rounds to the upper deck when the order came to fire. While they were getting the gun ready, we went ahead at slow speed. Then the captain said, "Now try some gunfire," and we went full speed ahead. At that moment the Dutch fired their torpedoes. We couldn't see them easily on account of the moonlight. Luckily, the junior officer saw it. He has good eyes, trained in flying. He shouted, "Torpedo track to port." The quartermaster, who was standing forward at the port lookout, pushed him out of the way, leapt to the bridge rail, and looked over the side and put the helm hard over to starboard. Suddenly I heard a hissing noise. If that one had hit us amidships or forward, I shouldn't have been able to get out. It was a very nasty feeling. I heard a bang aft, and we supposed that the first torpedo had just grazed along our side. The second one came a bit further over to port, so we turned to starboard and turned, so to speak, right into the course of the torpedo. The torpedo must have exploded right on the screw. There was a loud report, and I thought my head would split. I looked down and saw a red flame and a fearful cloud of smoke. I pulled myself up, and at the moment water began to come in. I was outside, and looked around, and there were a few men aft and a few to our right. The captain shouted, "Keep together!" Then he began to count us all and call our names to see who was there. He asked me, "Has anybody else come out?" And I said, "No, I am the last." Then we began swimming. I had completely lost all sense of the enemy's position. I could see the moon and the water, and faintly in the distance the coast. All at once I saw the black bow of the ship in front of me. My greatest fear as I swam towards the ship was that they might open fire with machine guns. Then the first of us got on board, and I heard them speaking German. 3 men pulled me up on deck. All survivors spoke gratefully of the treatment they received on board the Netherlands submarine, which brought them to Gibraltar. Appendix: List of crew of U-95. Survivors: officers 4, chief and petty officers 3, men 5, total 12. Casualties: officers 3, chief and petty officers 12, men 18, total 33. Total crew: officers 7, chief and petty officers 15, men 23, total 45.